A body crashed through the great hall doors and skidded across the stone floor. Blood smeared the rock behind him. He tried to push himself up. His arm gave out, and his face hit the ground again. Nobody moved to help him. Wolves stood around the edges of the hall, watching. Some of them smiled. The biggest one stepped forward and drove a boot into the fallen man's ribs. The sound echoed off the walls. Then a small figure pushed through the crowd. A woman named Mira. One hand cradled the swell of her belly. The other clutched a thin gray cloak against her chest. She was the only one who moved toward him instead of away. She knelt beside a bleeding stranger. And what she did next, in front of the entire pack, broke a silence that had held for 1,000 years. Stay with me on this one. Let me back up and tell you how she ended up in that hall. Mira was an Omega. In the world of the wolves, that word sat at the very bottom. Alphas ruled. Betas served and fought. And Omegas did the work nobody else wanted. Ate what was left after everyone else had eaten, and slept wherever there was room. That was the order of things. It had been the order of things longer than anyone could remember. So Mira had learned to live small. She kept her eyes down. She spoke when she was spoken to. She did her work and asked for nothing, because asking for things was how an Omega got noticed, and getting noticed was how an Omega got hurt. But here's the thing you need to know about her. She was carrying a child. Her mate had been a beta named Doran. A gentle man in a place that had no use for gentle. He got sent off to the border wars 2 seasons back. And one cold morning a rider came home carrying Doran's sword and not Doran. That was all she got. A sword and a silence. There was no body to bury, so she buried the sword instead, out behind the kennels where nobody would think to dig. Now she was alone. She was pregnant. And she was an Omega. 3 things that, stacked one on top of the other, made her about the most worthless creature in the whole pack. At least in the eyes of the wolf who ruled it. His name was Bracken. Bracken wasn't the true king. Understand that. The true Alpha King had ridden north a year ago to fight the wars himself, and he'd left Bracken to hold the seat until he returned. But a man who sits in a king's chair long enough starts to forget it isn't his. Bracken stopped sending word to the front. He stopped counting the days. He started acting like the throne had always been his, and he dared anyone in the pack to say otherwise. Nobody said otherwise. That's how fear works. It doesn't need chains. It just needs everyone to agree quietly to look away. And Bracken had a particular cruelty toward Omegas. He liked to remind them what they were. He'd take their portion at the table. He'd make them stand in the cold while the betas ate. He once made an Omega girl carry water up the tower stairs all night, just because she'd looked him in the eye by accident. There was a story everybody whispered about a stable hand named Petra. An Omega like Mira. She'd done nothing more than drop a tray at Bracken's feet, and he'd had her put out past the walls for 3 nights as a lesson to the rest of them. She came back changed. Quiet in a way that didn't fix itself. After that, nobody dropped anything near Bracken. Nobody looked at him. Nobody gave him a single reason to remember they existed. So Mira survived it the way you survive weather. You don't fight it. You wrap up. You keep your head down. You wait for it to pass. That gray cloak of hers was the waiting wrapped up part. It was the only warm thing she owned. Doran had traded a month of his rations for it before he left, so she wouldn't be cold while he was gone. The wool was thin now, worn through at the elbows, but it held heat, and in that drafty stone fortress, heat was the difference between a hard night and a dangerous one, especially for a woman growing a child. She never took it off. The other Omegas joked that she'd be buried in it. The night this all happened, Bracken had called the whole pack into the Great Hall. Word had gone around that his hunters had caught something out in the eastern woods. A rogue, they said. A spy. A wolf with no pack and no name, sniffing around the fortress walls. Mira didn't want to go. A summons from Bracken was never good news. But Omegas didn't get to skip the King's Hall, and the False King's Hall least of all. So she went and she found a spot near the back wall, away from the torches, and she made herself small the way she always did. The doors banged open. Two of Bracken's hunters dragged the rogue in by the arms and threw him onto the floor. And that brings us right back to where we started. The blood on the stone, the boot in the ribs, a whole hall full of wolves, watching a man bleed, and not one of them lifting a finger. Mira told herself to look away. Look away. It's not your business. You have a child to think about. But she couldn't stop looking at his hands. The man on the floor had stopped trying to get up. He just lay there, breathing in shallow pulls, and Mira watched his hands open and close against the cold stone. Slow, like he was holding on to consciousness one finger at a time. There was something about the way he wouldn't cry out. Bracken's men had beaten him bloody, and he hadn't made a sound. Not one. Most men beg. This one just breathed and held on. Bracken strode out into the center of the hall and raised his arms wide. "Look at it," he called out. "A rogue. No pack. No name. It crawled up to our walls in the dark like a thief. You all know what we do with thieves." A murmur went through the crowd. Not agreement exactly. More like the sound a room makes when everyone's afraid to be the one who stays quiet. "We let it bleed," Bracken said. "We let it lie there on the cold stone all night, where everyone can see. And in the morning, if it's still breathing, then we'll talk about what's left of it." He looked around the hall, slow, daring anyone to object. Nobody did. And here's where I need you to understand something about that fortress. The cold in there at night wasn't an inconvenience. It killed. The stone pulled the warmth out of you while you slept. A healthy beta could last a night on the floor and wake up stiff and miserable. A man already beaten half to death, lying in his own blood, with no cloak and no fire? That wasn't a punishment. That was an execution that just took longer to watch. And everyone in that hall knew it. They knew exactly what Bracken was doing. He was killing the man slowly, in the open, and forcing the whole pack to stand there and agree to it with their silence. Myra's hands had gone tight around her cloak. She thought about Doran. About a rider carrying home a sword and nothing else. About what it means to die somewhere far from anyone who would have warmed you. She thought about the child inside her who would be born an Omega at the bottom, in a pack where this was how things went. And she thought very clearly, a thought she should not have had. He's somebody's son. She didn't decide to move. That's the honest truth of it. Her feet just started walking before the rest of her could talk her out of it. She pushed through the crowd, past the betas, past the hunters, out into the open center of the hall where the torchlight was bright and there was nowhere to hide. The whole room turned to look at her. She knelt down beside the bleeding man. Up close he was bigger than he'd looked on the floor. Broad through the shoulders, even folded up like that. Thick neck. A short soldier's haircut going gray at the edges. Old scars on his forearms, the kind you only get from real fighting. He didn't look like any rogue she'd ever heard of. He looked like someone who'd seen 100 battles and won most of them. His eyes opened, just barely. He looked at her, and he didn't say anything because he didn't have the strength to. Mira pulled the cloak off her own shoulders. The cold hit her instantly. She felt it go straight through her thin dress and into her bones, and she felt the child shift inside her like it felt it too. But she didn't stop. She leaned over the stranger and she laid that gray cloak across his back and his shoulders, and she tucked it down along his side the way you tuck in someone you loved. The hall had gone completely silent. You could hear the torches. "What are you doing?" Bracken's voice cracked across the room like a whip. "Omega, what do you think you're doing?" Mira didn't look up at him. She kept her hands on the cloak. She was shaking, partly from the cold and partly from the fear, but she made herself speak. "He's cold," she said. "That's all. He's just cold. Take it off him." "No," she said. The word came out so quiet she almost didn't hear it herself. But in that silent hall, everyone heard it. And Omega had said no to Bracken. Out loud. In front of the entire pack. The bleeding man's eyes were open wider now, fixed on her face. And with what little voice he had left, he managed 3 words. "Why?" he breathed. "Why help me?" Mira leaned close so he could hear her. And here is the part one want you to really listen to. Because she didn't ask him for protection. She didn't ask him to save her. She didn't even ask him to live. She knew Omegas didn't get to ask for things like that. She asked for the smallest thing in the world. "I'm not asking you for anything," she whispered. If you live through tonight, if you ever get warm again." Her voice caught. "I'm going to have a baby soon, and it'll be an Omega like me, and nobody in this place will ever tell it that it matters. So if you live, someday, could you just say one kind word to my child? Just once? So it hears it from somebody, even if it's a stranger." She sat back on her heels. "That's all I want," she said. "Keep the cloak. Stay warm. And remember, a baby out there is going to need to hear that someday." The stranger stared at her. Something moved across his ruined face that she couldn't read. And for a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Bracken didn't strike her. The hunters didn't grab her. The pack didn't roar. The whole hall just held its breath. And then, slowly, the moment seemed to pass. Bracken let out a short, ugly laugh and waved his hand, like she was beneath bothering with. "Let the Omega freeze with him, then," he sneered, and turned away to pour himself a drink. Myra's heart was slamming against her ribs, but she was still alive. No one had hit her. No one had dragged her off. She let out a long, shaking breath and pressed her hand to her belly, and she thought, somehow, against everything she knew about this place, "It's over. He's distracted. I survived it." She was wrong about that. It wasn't over. It was about to become something else entirely. The bleeding man moved. Not the slow, broken movement of before. He planted one hand flat on the stone and he pushed himself up, and this time his arm did not give out. He rose to one knee, then to his feet. The gray cloak slid from his shoulders and pooled on the floor, and he stood there in the torchlight, swaying, bloody, but standing taller than anyone in that room. He wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. And when he looked up, the look on his face was not the look of a beaten rogue. It was the look of a king who had just decided to stop pretending. "Bracken," he said. His voice filled the hall now, deep and steady, with none of the weakness left in it. "You've gotten comfortable in my chair." Bracken turned around with his drink halfway to his mouth. "And I want you to picture his face, because the color drained out of it all at once. The cup slipped out of his hand and shattered on the floor. Because he knew that voice. "That's not possible," Bracken whispered. "You're dead. The wars. You're dead." "You hoped," the man said. "You sent word to the front that I'd fallen, didn't you? You stopped the riders. You sat in my hall and let my pack believe their king was gone, so the chair could become yours." He took a step forward and Bracken took a step back without meaning to. "I came home alone, in the dark, with no banner and no guard, because I wanted to see with my own eyes what kind of pack you'd built while you thought no one was coming back. Your hunters didn't recognize their own king. That tells me everything I need to know." He reached down, slow, and pulled something off the floor where it had fallen in the beating. A heavy ring, gold, with the mark of the pack pressed into it. He slid it back onto his finger and held up his hand so the whole hall could see. A sound went through the crowd then. Not a murmur this time. A gasp and then dozens of bodies dropping. All across the great hall, wolves were going down to one knee, heads bowed, the way you bow to the one who rules you. The rogue was no rogue. He was Kale, the true Alpha King, and he had been standing among them, bleeding, the entire time. Now stop and feel what just happened to this story. A minute ago this was about one Omega who'd broken a rule. Whether she'd be punished. Whether she'd freeze. A small, sad, private thing in the corner of a cruel hall. It is not that anymore. Now it's treason. Now it's a false king caught red-handed by the true one. Now every single wolf in that room has to answer for the night they stood silent and let their king bleed on the floor. The stakes didn't just get bigger. They changed shape completely, and the woman kneeling in the middle of it, with no cloak and a child in her belly, is suddenly standing at the very center of the most dangerous moment that Fortress had seen in a generation. If you're still with me, take 1 second and hit that subscribe button. This is the part of the story I most want you to see all the way through, and it helps more than you know. Alright, back to that hall. Cale's eyes moved to the 2 hunters who'd dragged him in. The same 2 who'd thrown him onto the stone and called him a rogue to his face. You, he said, you laid hands on your king and didn't know it. That's not your crime. A man can be fooled in the dark. Your crime is that you'd have let me die on this floor for the entertainment of the one paying you, and never once asked yourselves if it was right. He let that sit. You'll have a chance to earn your way back. Tonight you start by remembering which wolf in this hall actually behaved like she had a king's blood in her. And it wasn't any of you. Both hunters went down on their knees and stayed there. Cale turned, not toward Bracken, toward Mira. And Bracken, desperate, seeing his last chance slipping away, snarled and lunged. He grabbed Mira by the arm and hauled her up off the floor, hard, and his other hand went around her throat. "Stay back," he shouted at the king. "Stay back or I'll snap her neck. She's nothing. She's an Omega. You'll let me walk out of here for the sake of a worthless Omega and her bastard, or I swear I'll—" He didn't finish, because Cale had gone very, very still, and the air in the hall changed. You know how it feels right before lightning? That weight, that charge. Every wolf in the room felt the hair stand up on the back of their neck, because the king's eyes had locked onto Mira, and onto the hand around her throat, and something in him had just woken all the way up. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost quiet, and it was the most frightening thing anyone there had ever heard. "Take your hand," Cale said. "Off my mate." Mate. The word landed in that hall like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples went out through every wolf in the room. Because here's what had happened. Down on that cold floor, in the moment Mira leaned over a bleeding stranger and tucked a cloak around his shoulders. Her scent had reached him, and a wolf knows his fated mate by scent. It is the one thing in their world that cannot be faked, cannot be ranked, cannot be ordered around by any king or pretender. It simply is. The fates decide it, and the bond does the rest. Cale had felt it the instant she knelt beside him. He'd been half dead on the floor, and through all the blood and the cold and the pain, his wolf had lifted its head and said, in a voice older than the pack itself, "There she is. There she is. After all these years. There she is." He'd asked her why she was helping him, and she'd told him she wanted nothing. She'd asked only that someday, someone might say one kind word to a child who would be born with nothing. The most powerful wolf in the kingdom had lain there bleeding and listened to his own fated mate ask the world for the smallest mercy it could possibly give. And ask it not for herself but for a child. That was the moment it broke him open. Not the beating, not the betrayal. And it wasn't only him who knew it now. A bond like that doesn't stay quiet. Every alpha in the hall could feel the truth of it rolling off the king in waves, the way you feel heat off a fire without being told it's hot. There was no arguing with it, no ranking it. The fates had tied the most powerful wolf in the kingdom to a pregnant Omega the whole pack had been taught to step over, and not one wolf in that room could stand up and say it wasn't so. The thing they'd built their whole world on, the idea that an Omega was the lowest thing among them, had just been called a lie by something far older than any of them. Bracken's hand was still on Myra's throat, but it was loosening now because Bracken had finally understood what he was holding, and what it meant and how completely he had lost. "You're lying," Bracken said, but there was no strength in it. "She's an Omega. A king doesn't." "A king does," Cale said. He crossed the hall in 3 strides. He took Bracken's wrist in one hand and he peeled it off Myra's throat, and the strength in that grip made Bracken cry out and go to his knees. The same boot that had driven into Kale's ribs an hour ago was now folded under a man begging on the floor. Kale held him there without effort. "You stood my pack in this hall," Kale said, loud enough for all of them. "And you taught them that an Omega is worth nothing, that a pregnant woman is the lowest thing among us. And then she, his voice cracked, and he didn't hide it. She gave the only warm thing she owned to a stranger she thought was dying, and she asked for nothing but a kind word for a baby. In a room full of alphas and betas who stood there and watched me bleed." He looked around the hall at every bowed head. "You all want to know what strength is," he said. "You've had it backwards your whole lives. You thought it was the boot, the grip on the throat, the loudest voice in the room. It isn't. I have crossed battlefields. I have killed more wolves than I can count. And I am telling you, none of it took the kind of strength it took for that woman to walk out into this hall alone and kneel down beside me. And then the king did the thing that broke the pack. He let go of Bracken. He turned to Mira. And in front of every wolf in that fortress, in front of the alphas and the betas and the false king on his knees, the most powerful wolf in the kingdom lowered himself down onto one knee before a pregnant Omega. The hall made a sound like the breath going out of a single body. A king does not kneel. Not to anyone. It had not happened in 1,000 years. There was no law for it because no one had ever imagined it was possible. And here was Kale on one knee, looking up at a woman the whole pack had been taught to step over. He picked up the gray cloak from the floor, the thin, worn-through cloak door and had traded a month of food for, and he reached up and laid it gently back around Myra's shoulders, and he closed his hands over hers. "You gave me your warmth when you thought I had nothing to give you back," he said, just to her, though the silent hall heard every word. "Now I'm going to spend the rest of my life giving it back to you. You and your child both." Mira was crying. She didn't even know when she'd started. "I didn't know who you were," she said. "I know," Kale said. "That's exactly why it counts." He stood, and he turned, still holding her hand, and he faced his pack. "This is your queen," he said. "Her child is my heir. And the first wolf who ever again treats an Omega the way this one was treated will answer to me directly. Do you understand?" The hall answered him. Every head bowed lower. Behind them, Bracken tried to run. He didn't get 3 steps. The king's hunters, the same ones who dragged Kale in by the arms, took hold of their false master and held him fast. Whatever justice came for Bracken after that night, it was the king's to give, and it was not gentle. But that's not the part of the story worth telling. The part worth telling is the woman in the worn gray cloak, standing in the center of the hall, with the most powerful wolf in the kingdom holding her hand like it was the only thing that had ever mattered to him. They say the fortress changed after that night, and not slowly. All at once. By the next morning the riders were going out again, north to the front, carrying the truth. The king lives. The king is home. Whatever Bracken had broken in that year of silence, Kale set about mending it, and the first thing he mended was the thing closest to the floor. The order of the pack, the one that had stood for 1,000 years, the one that put Omegas at the very bottom. He didn't abolish it with a grand speech. He did something simpler and harder to argue with. He sat his Omega queen beside him at the high table, in full view every single day, and he let the pack get used to the sight of it. He let them watch her grow rounder with the child. He let them watch him pull out her chair, and fill her plate first, and warm her hands when the hall went cold. You can't order wolves to respect someone, but you can show them over and over until the old idea just quietly dies of being wrong. The other Omegas felt it first. They stood up a little straighter. They started eating at the table instead of after it. One of them, the young girl Bracken had once made carry water all night, became Myra's closest companion, and within a year she was running half the household. And Petra, the stable hand who'd come back from those 3 nights past the wall so quiet and so broken. Mira went and found her herself and sat with her, and gave her work that mattered, and slowly, over many seasons, some of the quiet wore off. It never fully left. Some things don't. But Petra lived to see a world where what had been done to her could never be done to another Omega again. And she said, near the end of her life, that watching that change happen was the thing that gave her back to herself. Myra's child was born in the spring. A girl. An Omega, just as Mira had said she would be. And here is where the story finds its way home. Because do you remember what Mira asked for? Down on that cold floor, when she thought she was kneeling beside a dying stranger. She didn't ask to be saved. She didn't ask to be queen. She asked one thing and one thing only. That someday, somehow, one kind word might be said to her child. So it would know it mattered, even if it heard it from a stranger. Kale remembered. The day the baby was born, the king came into the room, and this enormous wolf, this scarred warrior who had crossed battlefields, sat down on the edge of the bed as careful as if the whole world were made of glass. He took that tiny Omega girl into his huge hands, and he leaned down close and he said the words, not as a stranger, as her father. You matter, he whispered to her. You matter more than anything in this kingdom, and you are going to grow up hearing that every single day of your life. Mira watched from the pillow, and she thought about a rider coming home with a sword and not a man. She thought about a sword buried out behind the kennels. She thought about how close she'd come, that night, to looking away like everyone else. She was glad, every day for the rest of her life, that she hadn't. The gray cloak, Duran's cloak, she kept it, worn through at the elbows, thin as it was. She could have had 100 fine cloaks, lined with fur, fit for a queen. But that thin gray one hung by the door of the royal chambers until the end of her days, because it was the truest thing she owned. It was the thing that had no warmth left to spare, and she'd given it away anyway, and that turned out to be the strongest thing anyone in that whole kingdom had ever done. People came to expect a certain thing of that pack in the years after. Travelers would talk about it. They'd say there was a kingdom in the north where the king had once knelt to an Omega, and where they'd gotten the whole idea of strength turned the right way around. Where the strongest wolf wasn't the one with the loudest voice or the heaviest boot. It was the one who'd give away their last warmth to a stranger and ask for nothing back. And it all came from one night, one cold hall, one woman who couldn't stop looking at a dying man's hands, and who walked out into the open when every instinct she had was screaming at her to stay small and stay safe. She thought she was giving away the only warm thing she had. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the warmth you give to a stranger when you expect nothing in return is the one kind that always finds its way back to you. That's the story. Thank you for staying with me to the end of it. Take care of each other out there.